The locals called it the Crimson Stream. Legends surrounded the winding river deep in the wilderness, but none dared speak of them openly. To the daring, it was a challenge; to the wise, it was a curse. Four friends, thrill-seekers in their mid-20s, decided the river was their next adventure. Juliet, the group's de facto leader, had heard about it in a travel blog that described its pristine, uncharted waters. "It's just folklore," she said, dismissing the locals' warnings. "Rivers don't turn red on their own. It's probably minerals or algae." The group set out at dawn, their kayaks gliding through the crystal-clear waters. Dense trees on either side of the river blocked out the sun, casting long shadows across the surface. The air was cool, and the only sounds were the distant chirps of birds and the rhythmic splash of their paddles. Hours into the trip, they reached a narrow bend. The water's hue began to shift subtly. First, it was a faint tinge of pink, barely noticeable. "See? Algae bloom," Juliet remarked. But as they paddled further, the color deepened to a rusty red, staining the rocks and plants along the riverbanks. "This doesn't feel right," Eliza said, her voice trembling. She was the quietest of the group, often teased for her cautious nature. "Relax, Eliza," said Wei, the joker of the group. "It's just iron in the water. Nature's way of being dramatic." But the color wasn't the only thing changing. The water thickened, its once refreshing scent replaced by a metallic tang that clung to the air. Dead fish floated to the surface, their lifeless eyes staring skyward. "Okay, this is officially weird," Hao said, paddling faster to catch up with Juliet. "Maybe we should turn back." Juliet hesitated, her confident demeanor cracking. "Just a little further. The map shows a clearing up ahead where we can camp." Reluctantly, the others followed. The river's current grew stronger, pulling them forward. The red deepened to a crimson so dark it looked black in the fading light. Strange, faint whispers began to echo from the riverbanks, but when they stopped to listen, all they could hear was the rustling of leaves. They reached the clearing just as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was eerily quiet. No birds, no insects, just the oppressive hum of the river. The group set up camp in uneasy silence. That night, they took turns keeping watch. Eliza was the first. As the others slept, she sat by the fire, her flashlight pointed at the river. It seemed to pulse, almost as if it were alive. Then she saw it, a pale hand reaching up from the water. She screamed, waking the others, but when they rushed to look, the river was still. "You're imagining things," Juliet said, though her own voice wavered. "We're all just tired." The group decided to leave at first light. But when dawn came, the river was unrecognizable. The water had thickened to the consistency of blood, and the current raged violently. The air reeked of decay, and the whispers had grown louder, now unmistakably human. As they prepared to launch their kayaks, the river rose unnaturally fast, submerging the banks. Juliet shouted for everyone to get in, but the current grabbed Eliza's kayak the moment it touched the water, flipping it. She screamed as the river dragged her under. The others paddled frantically to save her, but she was gone in seconds, her cries swallowed by the blood-red torrent. "We have to go back," Hao yelled. "We can't," Juliet screamed. The river was carrying them forward at a terrifying speed. They were no longer in control. The whispers grew louder, turning into guttural voices. Faces began to form in the water, twisted, anguished visages that screamed silently as they surged past. Wei's kayak capsized next. He clawed at the water, but something unseen dragged him down. His hand broke the surface once, then disappeared. "No!" Hao shouted, tears streaming down his face. The river carried him and Juliet deeper into the wilderness, the trees now bare and claw-like, reaching toward them as if alive. The river widened abruptly, opening into a vast, blood-red lake. At its center stood a massive stone altar, dark figures standing motionless atop it. The voices were deafening now, a chorus of pain and despair. Juliet and Howe's kayaks collided, throwing them into the water. Juliet struggled to stay afloat, the thick liquid pulling at her limbs. She saw Howe nearby, his face pale with terror. "Swim," she screamed, but he didn't move. A skeletal hand had wrapped around his ankle, dragging him under. His mouth opened in a silent scream before he vanished. Desperate, Juliet swam toward the altar, the only solid ground in sight. The figures atop it watched her approach, but didn't move. As she climbed onto the slick stone, she realized they weren't people, they were statues, carved with expressions of unspeakable agony. The whispers stopped. For a moment there was silence, broken only by Juliet's ragged breaths. Then the statues turned their heads toward her, their stone eyes bleeding. "You have come," a voice boomed, deep and guttural, resonating from the altar itself. The river roared, and the statues began to move, their stone limbs cracking as they reached for her. Juliet screamed as the altar split open, and the river rose to claim her. The last thing she saw was her reflection in the blood-red water, her face twisted into the same eternal agony as the statues. By the next morning, the river was clear again, its surface undisturbed. Locals would later tell stories of a group that had vanished, another warning to those who dared challenge the Crimson Stream.